The telegraph office in Caldwell Crossing stood at the end of Front Street. Like a period at the end of a sentence, nobody had finished writing yet, and on the morning of the 3rd of October, 1882, most of the town was gathered outside it to watch Maren Elde be told she was no longer needed there. She had known it was coming. The knowing had not made it smaller. She stood on the boardwalk with her satchel at her feet and her chin level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart, while Harlan Pruett, the regional superintendent for the Western Plains Telegraph Company, read from a paper he had prepared at his desk in Wichita and brought all the way to Caldwell Crossing for the purpose of reading to her. He was a man who liked paper. He liked the authority of it. He read the words in a voice that carried, and the street held its breath the way streets do when they sense a thing worth storing. The gist of it was this: the company was consolidating its stations. Caldwell Crossing would be reduced to a relay point only. A relay point did not require a full operator. A full operator, in any case, ought to be a man, which Harlan Pruett did not say aloud, but which the paper implied in its careful language about the demands of the position and the expectations of the clientele. Maren had been filling in since the previous operator, a Mr. Doyle, had taken ill in July. She had been filling in, and in filling in, she had sent and received more messages per day than Doyle had managed in his best month. The paper did not mention this. She did not correct it. She picked up her satchel when he was finished. She said, "Thank you for making the trip, Mr. Pruett." She said it the way you say a thing when you mean it to be the end of a conversation and not the beginning of one. Then she walked off the boardwalk and into the street and did not look back, because looking back would have given the people watching something they had not earned. She had arrived in Caldwell Crossing 11 months prior with $43, a certificate from the Morse telegraphy course she had completed in St. Louis, and the kind of pass that fits in a single paragraph without requiring embellishment. She had been raised in a Lutheran orphanage outside of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, until she was 16, at which point she had been placed with a farm family in need of help, at which point she had helped until she had saved enough to leave, at which point she had left. She had taught herself to read circuits from a borrowed manual. She had paid for the St. Louis course herself. She had no family to return to and no husband to absorb the loss of her income, which meant the loss was hers alone to carry, which she was accustomed to. The town of Caldwell Crossing was not a cruel town. It was simply a town that had opinions about what women could and could not manage, and it held those opinions with the comfortable certainty of people who have never been required to test them. There were exceptions, as there always are. Mrs. Halverson at the dry goods store, who had run the store alone for 9 years after her husband's death and who had no patience for comfortable certainties. Old Bergerlund, who had homesteaded the ridgeland north of town and who judged people by whether they could read weather and work, and by nothing else. And there was a man named Callum Voss, who had been standing at the far end of the boardwalk that morning with a length of telegraph wire coiled over one shoulder, and a look on his face that was not pity and was not contempt, and was not the performed concern that some of the other watching faces wore. It was something quieter than any of those things. He watched her walk away, and then he went back to what he had been doing, which was restringing the section of line that ran from the relay post at the edge of town out toward the Lund property. And he did not say anything to anyone about what he had seen. He thought about it, though. He thought about it while he worked, and he was still thinking about it at noon when he stopped at the Halverson store for a tin of coffee and found Maren Elde at the counter, asking Mrs. Halverson if she knew of anyone in need of a boarder who could also cook and keep accounts. He did not interrupt. He bought his coffee. He stood near the door and listened to Mrs. Halverson tell her that the Greer family sometimes took boarders, but that Mrs. Greer had a tongue like a file, and she would not recommend it for a woman who had already had a difficult morning. Then he said, from near the door, without turning it into more than it was, that he had a situation that might suit if she was willing to hear it. She turned and looked at him. She was not a small woman. She had gray eyes and the kind of stillness in her face that comes from long practice at not giving things away. She said, "I'm listening." He said his name was Callum Voss. He said he had a farm 4 miles out, on the east side of the ridge, and that he also contracted telegraph line work for the company, which was why he was in town. He said his wife had passed 2 winters ago, and that he had 2 children, a girl of 9 named Petra and a boy of 5 named Rune, and that he had a woman from town who came out 3 days a week to cook and mind the house, but that she was leaving at the end of the month to go live with her daughter in Topeka, and he was going to need someone steady. He said he could offer a room, meals, and a fair wage for cooking and keeping the house, and that there was also a telegraph instrument at the farm, a working one, because the company ran a spur line out to his property for the line work, and if she wanted to keep her hand in, she was welcome to use it. He said all of this plainly, looking at her the way you look at someone you are making a business proposal to, which was what he believed he was doing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you show me the instrument?" He said he could. She said, "All right." She picked up her satchel. Mrs. Halverson watched them go and did not say a word, which for Mrs. Halverson was a significant act of restraint. The farm sat in a fold of land between the ridge and the creek, and it was a working farm in the way that working farms look, which is to say that it was not pretty, but it was serious. The barn was tight and well kept. The fences were in good repair. The house was a frame house, 2 stories, with a porch that listed slightly to the east, and a kitchen that was larger than the parlor, which told her something about who lived there and what they valued. The instrument was in a small room off the kitchen that had originally been a larder, and was a good instrument, a Morse register with a clean sounder, and the line was live. She sat down at the table and sent a test sequence and listened to the return, and something in her shoulders came down that had been up since morning. Petra was standing in the doorway when she turned around. The girl had her father's dark hair and an expression of thorough assessment that made her look older than 9. She said, "You're the lady from the telegraph office." Maren said, "I was." Petra said, "They let you go because you're a woman." Maren said, "That is more or less correct." Petra considered this. Then she said, "Papa let the last woman go because she burned the beans 3 times in 1 week." She said it with the gravity of someone reporting a serious moral failing. "Burnt beans are a serious matter. I don't take them lightly." The corner of Callum's mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. Maren said, "I don't either." She stayed. The first week was the work of learning a household, which is always the work of learning a set of small private systems that look random from the outside and have their own logic from the inside. She learned that Callum took his coffee, black and early, before the children were up, and that he was already out in the barn by the time she came down to start the stove. She learned that Petra set the table without being asked, and that Rune could not be trusted near the butter dish without supervision. She learned that there was a loose step on the back porch, 3rd from the bottom, that caught the heel if you weren't watching for it, and that everyone in the household had simply learned to watch for it, the way you learn to accommodate a thing you have stopped expecting anyone to fix. She made bread on the 2nd day, and the children ate it with the focused attention of people who had been missing something without knowing the name of it. She made a soup on the 4th day from the last of the garden's carrots and some dried beans from the larder, and Rune ate 2 bowls, and then fell asleep at the table, which Callum carried him away from without waking him, moving through the kitchen with the particular quiet of a man who has done this many times. She kept the instrument active in the evenings. She copied traffic, she practiced her speed, she monitored the line conditions. On the 6th evening, a message came through her, addressed to the Caldwell Crossing station, that the relay there had garbled and she cleaned it up and forwarded it correctly, and the acknowledgement that came back was crisp and grateful, and she sat with that for a moment before she went to bed. By the second week, Petra had taken to sitting at the kitchen table with her schoolwork while Maren cooked, which was not something Petra had done before, and which she did not explain, and which Maren did not ask her to explain. By the third week, Rune had started calling her by name, which he shortened to Wren, because 5-year-olds have their own economies of language. He said Wren the way he said barn and bread and warm, as a word for something that was simply part of the world now and could be relied upon. Callum noticed. He noticed the way a man notices things he has decided not to speak about, which is to say carefully, and with the awareness that the noticing is its own form of acknowledgement. He had been a man who had carried too much for too long, long enough that he had stopped noticing the weight. His wife, Sigrid, had been a woman of great warmth and great competence, and her absence had left the house with a quality he could only describe as incomplete, the way a sentence is incomplete when it stops before the thought is done. He had not expected to feel the incompleteness lifting. He had not planned for it. He said nothing about any of this. He fixed the loose step on the back porch on a Thursday morning, third week of October, while she was inside starting breakfast. He used 3 new boards and set them flush and solid, and when she came out later with the slop bucket for the pigs, she stepped on the new boards and felt the difference and looked down at them for a moment. Nothing said about the step. She said nothing about it either. But something had been said. She had been at the farm for nearly a month when the line went down. It happened on a Wednesday night, late in October, when a storm came in off the plains with the kind of speed and indifference that plains storms have, not building gradually the way storms in gentler country do, but arriving all at once, as if they had been waiting just over the horizon for permission. The wind took 3 sections of line down between the farm and the relay post at the edge of town, and by morning the instrument in the larder room was silent. Callum was already pulling on his coat when she came downstairs. He said the line was down and that he needed to ride out and assess the damage. He said it might take all day. She said, "I know the line." He looked at her. She said, "I watched you work the first section when you were in town. I know the splice method you use. I've read the company manual twice through." She paused. She said, "I can ride." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was deciding something. Then he said, "The east section is worse. I'll take that." He nodded toward the barn, where the tools were. He said, "The splice kit is on the left wall, second hook." She had the horse saddled and the kit packed before he was done with his own. Petra stood on the porch watching them go, with an expression that was not worry exactly, but with something adjacent to it, something that looked like the beginning of trust. The line damage on the west section was 3 breaks in a quarter-mile stretch, the wire pulled down by a cottonwood limb that the storm had stripped and thrown. She worked in the cold with numb hands, climbing the poles with the cleats she had found in the kit, making the splices the way she had read them and the way she had watched, her fingers finding the method through the doing of it. The wind was still moving across the grass, low and fast, and the light was thin and flat and the color of old tin. She finished the last splice by early afternoon and sent a test signal from the portable sounder she had brought in the kit. The line was live. She rode back to find Callum already at the farm, his own section done, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that Petra had made for him, which was not something Petra had done before. He looked up when she came in. She set the kit on the table. She said, "West section is clear. 3 breaks, all spliced. Line is live." He looked at the kit. He looked at her hands, which were red from the cold and had a cut on the right palm from the wire. He got up and went to the cabinet above the stove where the bandaging was kept, and he came back and sat down across from her, and took her hand and wrapped it with a firmness that was also a kind of gentleness, the way you close a book you mean to return to. Neither of them said anything. Rune came in from the back room and looked at the two of them at the table and said, "Wren fixed the wire." Callum said, "She did." Rune said, "I knew she would." He said it with the absolute confidence of someone who had not considered any other outcome. And then he went back to what he had been doing, and the kitchen held the warmth of the stove and the smell of the coffee Petra had made. And outside the wind was settling, and the light was going, and the fields were going gray and quiet under the last of the afternoon. Callum did not let go of her hand right away. He set it down on the table when he was done wrapping it, carefully, the way you set down something you're not finished thinking about, and she left it there for a moment before she drew it back. And neither of them looked at the other, and neither of them said a word, and the thing that was between them was as plain as the table, and as unspoken as the step he had fixed 3 weeks ago, and it was enough for now to simply be in the same room with it. The company sent a man out the following week to inspect the repaired sections. His name was Aldous Fitch, and he was a line inspector from the district office. And he was the kind of man who wrote things down in a small notebook and then read them back to you, as if the reading back was itself a form of authority. He walked the west section and examined the splices, and wrote in his notebook, and said nothing to Maren while he was doing it, because she was a woman standing in a field holding a horse. And he did not see any reason to address her. He came back to the farm and sat at the kitchen table and told Callum that the west section splices were clean work, better than clean, that they had been made with a precision he did not often see in field repairs, and that whoever had done them had a thorough knowledge of the company's method. Callum said, "Miss Elde did that section." Aldous Fitch looked up from his notebook. Callum said it again in the same way, because it was the same fact both times. Fitch looked at Maren, who was at the stove and did not turn around. He wrote something in his notebook. He said, "Well." He said it the way people say "well" when they have encountered a fact that does not fit the shape of their understanding, and they have decided not to rearrange the understanding but simply to set the fact aside somewhere. He left the next morning. The company received his report the following week, and the week after that, a letter arrived at the farm addressed to Miss Elde, offering her a contract position as a line technician and secondary operator for the Caldwell Crossing district, at a wage that was not generous but was fair, which in the context of what the company had previously offered women, which was nothing, was a kind of revolution conducted entirely on paper. She read the letter twice. She set it on the table. She went back to the stove. Callum read it that evening. He set it back down without a word, but she caught the look on his face before he set it aside, the thing that moved across it and that he put away. And it was not pride exactly, though it was close to pride. It was something quieter, something that looked like relief, the way you feel relief when you realize that a thing you were worried about has turned out to be exactly as solid as you hoped. She sent her acceptance the next morning from the instrument in the larder room. She had not expected Harlan Pruett to come back. He came on a Friday in the middle of November, on the same coach he had taken the first time, with the same prepared look and a different piece of paper. He did not go to the farm. He went to the telegraph office in town first, where the new relay man, a young fellow named Gus who was 22 and overwhelmed, told him that yes, the district had contracted a Miss Elde for line work, and that yes, she was the one who had repaired the October storm damage, and that yes, the company had sent the contract themselves. Pruett's face did not change while Gus told him these things, because Pruett was a man who kept his face arranged. But he went from the telegraph office to the Caldwell Crossing Hotel, and he sat in the dining room there and had a meal. And he talked to the people who came through, and he said things about the impropriety of a woman living on a man's farm without a proper arrangement, and about the company's reputation, and about what the district manager would think when he understood the full situation. He did not say these things loudly. He said them in the way of a man who is planting, not broadcasting, the way you put seeds in ground you intend to come back to. He found his most willing listener in a woman named Dorothea Crane, who had a voice built for distance and a habit of concern that she had prepared at home before she brought it out in public. Dorothea Crane had been in the dining room when Pruett arrived, and she left it with a full account of his concerns and the particular energy of someone who has been given a purpose. By Saturday morning there was talk in the town. Maren heard it on Saturday afternoon, when she came in for supplies, and Mrs. Halverson told her, because Mrs. Halverson believed that a woman deserved to know what was being said about her and who was saying it. She told her plainly and without softening it, because that was also what she believed. Maren listened. She bought her supplies. She said, "Thank you," and she meant it in the same way she had meant it to Pruett the first time, as the end of a conversation and not the beginning of one. She drove back to the farm in the wagon, and she did not say anything to Callum that evening, because there was supper to make, and Rune had a cough that needed watching, and Petra had arithmetic that needed checking, and the evening was full of the small necessary things that evenings on a farm are full of. And she moved through them with the same steadiness she brought to everything, and she did not let what was moving underneath her surface show. But Callum had been in town that morning. He had heard the talk before she had, and he had heard who was doing the talking, and he had heard the name Harlan Pruett, and he had stood in the street outside the feed store with a stillness that the men around him recognized as the kind of stillness that precedes something. And then he had gone about his business, and he had come home and been quiet at supper in a way that was different from his usual quiet, which was the quiet of a man at rest. This was the quiet of a man who was deciding. On Sunday morning, Harlan Pruett held an informal meeting in the hotel dining room. He had not announced it as a meeting. He had simply let it be known that he would be available to speak with anyone who had concerns about the company's arrangements in the district. And enough people came that the dining room was full, and Dorothea Crane was in the front of it with her concern already arranged on her face. Maren did not know about the meeting. She was at the farm. She was at the instrument in the larder room, monitoring the Sunday morning traffic, which was light but steady. A message from a rancher east of town about cattle prices. A weather report from the station at Dodge. A personal message from a woman in Wichita to her sister in the county, which Maren received and logged with the same care she gave to everything. Callum was at the hotel. He came in while Pruett was talking, and he stood at the back of the room, and he waited until Pruett had finished his prepared remarks about company reputation and proper arrangements and the concerns of the community, and then he walked to the front of the room, and he stood where Pruett was standing, and he said what he had to say. He said that Maren Elde had come to his farm as an employee, at a fair wage, in a room of her own, with his children as her household, and that there was nothing improper about the arrangement, and never had been. He said that she had repaired 3 sections of downed line in a plain storm, alone, in conditions that had kept most of the men in town indoors, and that the company inspector had called the work the best field repair he had seen in the district. He said that the company had recognized this by offering her a contract, and that the contract was legitimate and earned, and that no one in this room had anything to say about it that would change either of those facts. He said that Harlan Pruett had come to Caldwell Crossing in October to tell a qualified woman she was not needed, and that Pruett had been wrong then, and that whatever he was doing now was an extension of the same wrongness, and that the town would do well to notice the difference between a man with a paper and a man with a point. He said all of this in the same flat, plain voice he used for everything, without raising it, without ornamenting it. And when he was done, he looked at Pruett once, and then he looked at the room, and the room was very quiet. Dorothea Crane opened her mouth and closed it. Pruett said, "I was acting in the company's interest." Callum said, "The company sent her the contract." He let that sit. Then he said, "I think we're done here," and he walked out of the hotel and into the street, and the cold came down off the ridge, and the light was going fast. pulling the color out of the fields before you were ready for it to leave. He drove back to the farm. He did not tell her what had happened, not that day. He came in and washed up and sat down to Sunday dinner, which was a roast chicken that Petra had helped with, and that Rune had supervised from a chair pushed close to the stove, offering opinions about the smell. She knew something had happened. She could read him the way she had learned to read the line, by the quality of the silence and the things that were not being sent. She did not ask. After supper, after the children were in bed, she was at the kitchen table with the lamp and the logbook for the instrument, entering the day's traffic. He was at the other end of the table with a length of wire he was splicing for a repair job, his hands moving through the work with the automatic ease of long practice. The lamp put its light between them, and the house was quiet, and outside the wind had stopped, and the stars were out over the ridge in the particular abundance they have on cold, clear nights on the plains, when the sky seems closer than it has any right to be. He set down the wire. He said, "Pruett is leaving tomorrow." She looked up. He said, "I went to the hotel this morning." He said what needed saying, and she let him say it. And when he was done, she was quiet for a long time, looking at the logbook, and something moved across her face that she did not put away, not entirely. And it was not gratitude exactly, though it was close to gratitude. It was something that looked like the moment when you have been carrying something alone for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to set it down, and then someone takes the other end, and you feel the difference in your arms. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "Thank you." He picked up the wire again. He said, "The east section of line needs a full inspection before the hard freeze. I could use someone who knows the splice method." She said, "I know the splice method." He said, "I know you do." He worked for a little while longer, and then he set the wire down again, and he looked at the lamp rather than at her, and he said what he had been deciding since the night he had wrapped her hand after the storm, since the morning he had fixed the step without saying so, since the first week when he had watched her sit down at the instrument and send a test sequence and come back to herself. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say, nothing changes here. Your room is your room. Your contract is your contract. The work is yours regardless." She was still, the way she was still when she was giving something her full attention. He said, "I'm asking you to stay. Permanent, as my wife, if that's what you'd want." He looked at her then. He said, "I'm not asking you to give anything up. The line work, the instrument, all of it, that's yours. I'm asking if you want this too, on top of it." "Oh," he said, "you don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer until you're sure." The lamp held its light between them. Outside the stars were very bright, and the ridge was a dark line against them, and the farm was quiet, in the way that farms are quiet, on cold, clear nights, when the animals are settled, and the work is done, and the world has contracted to the size of a lit room, and the people in it. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the satchel at her feet on the boardwalk in October. She thought about the instrument in the larder room, and the way her shoulders had come down when she heard the line was live. She thought about the step, and the hand, and Rune saying "I knew she would," with the absolute confidence of someone who had not considered any other outcome. She said, "Yes." She said it simply and completely. Then she said, "That's what I want." He nodded. Something in him settled, the way a frame settles when the last post is set and the structure is finally what it was always meant to be. He said, "All right." He said it the way he had said it the first time, on the boardwalk outside the Halverson store, when she had said she was listening and he had said, "All right," and she had picked up her satchel. The words were the same. The weight of them was entirely different. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, and then he picked up the wire again, and she went back to the logbook, and the lamp burned between them, and the house was warm. Harlan Pruett left on the Monday morning coach, and the town watched him go. and that was the last Caldwell Crossing saw of him. Dorothea Crane stopped talking about the matter the following week, which was as close to an apology as such people give, and the town noted the absence of her voice on the subject and stored that up too, in the way that small towns store everything, for later and for always. They were married in the Halverson store on a Saturday in December because Mrs. Halverson offered the space, and because the store was warm, and because it was where the whole thing had properly begun, which seemed right to everyone who had been there that October noon, and who understood what had happened in the space between a man buying coffee and a woman asking about a room. The minister came out from the county seat. Petra stood beside Maren in a dress she had pressed herself very seriously the night before. Rune stood beside his father and held the ring, which was a plain iron band that had been Callum's grandmother's, worn smooth from years of work, and which fit Maren's hand as if it had been made for it. Old Birger Lund came in from the ridge for it, which surprised no one who knew him, because Birger Lund judged people by whether they could work and read weather. And he had made his judgment about Maren Elde in October when the line report came back from the inspector, and his presence was his verdict, plain and sufficient. The company renewed her contract in January, and in February they expanded it to include the full district line inspection, which had previously been Aldous Fitch's responsibility, and which Fitch was relieved to cede, because Fitch was a man who preferred the office to the field, and who had, since October, developed a sincere respect for people who did not. By the time the frost settled in for good that winter, the larder room had become something more than a room with an instrument in it. It had become the place where the farm connected to everything beyond the ridge, where the traffic of the world came in and went out through her hands, and where she sat some evenings with the lamp and the logbook and the sound of the sounder, and Callum came in sometimes and stood in the doorway and watched her work, and she knew he was there by the change in the air, and she did not stop what she was doing, and he did not say anything, and neither of them needed to. The satchel sat on the shelf above the instrument. She had not needed it since October. She had not put it away either. It was simply there, the way things are there when they have become part of a place, when they have stopped being about arriving and become about belonging. Spring came late that year, the way spring does on the plains when winter has decided it has more to say. But it came. The fields went from gray to brown, to a green so sudden and definitive it seemed like an argument. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods along the bank put out their leaves all at once, as if they had been waiting for permission and had finally received it. On a morning in April, Maren was out on the east section of line, walking the poles the way she walked them every spring, checking the insulators and the tension, the kit over her shoulder and the horse tied at the fence below. The sky was high and blue, and the air had the particular clarity of early spring mornings on the plains, when everything is washed and the distances are exact. She heard the instrument signal from the portable sounder in the kit. She stopped and took it out and listened. It was the district office. A routine check, confirming the east section was active. She sent back the confirmation, crisp and clean, and the acknowledgement came back the same way, and she put the sounder away and walked on down the line. Below her, the farm sat in its fold of land between the ridge and the creek, and she could see the barn, and the house and the porch where the step was solid now and had been solid since October, and she could see a small figure in the yard that was Rune, moving between the house and the barn with the busy, purposeful movement of a 5-year-old who has assigned himself an important task. And she could see Callum coming out of the barn and stopping in the yard and looking up toward the ridge. And though she was too far to see his face, she knew the quality of that stillness. And she knew what it meant, and she raised one hand, and after a moment he raised his. The line hummed in the wire above her, alive with the traffic of the world. messages going east and west across the plains, cattle prices and weather reports, and the private words of people to the people they loved, all of it moving through the copper at the speed of lightning, all of it passing through her hands. She walked on down the line. The morning was bright and cold, and the fields were green, and the ridge was solid at her back, and the farm was below her, and it was waiting, not the way a place waits when it is empty, but the way a place waits when it knows you are coming back. The cabin held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not anymore, and that was the story of Maren Elde and Callum Voss, a woman who arrived with a satchel and a certificate and a chin that would not drop, and who found, in the space between a downed line and a plain question asked across a kitchen table, that the life she had built from nothing was the surest kind there is. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.